China manufacturing facts that prove the world order has already changed forever. China's manufacturing facts don't just suggest the world order has changed, they prove it completely and permanently. China now accounts for over 28% of all global manufacturing output, more than the United States, Germany, and Japan combined. In a single day, Chinese factories produce more goods than most countries manufacture in an entire year. You heard that right, one day versus 1 year, and it isn't even close. The West has been arguing about tariffs, while these numbers have been sitting in plain sight for over a decade, and the facts you're about to hear aren't predictions, they're receipts. Let's start with the number that tells you everything, and it begins with a substance so basic, so unglamorous, that most people never think about it twice. Steel, the skeleton of civilization. Think about every structure that defines modern civilization. Skyscrapers, bridges, railways, aircraft carriers, oil pipelines, hospital buildings. Every single one of them starts with the same thing, steel. And right now, China makes 50% of all the steel produced on Earth. Not a plurality, not a slim majority, half. Every other nation on the planet combined makes the other half. You heard that right. Every country in the world, working together, barely matches what China does alone. But here's where it stops being just an impressive statistic and starts being a geopolitical fact you can't argue with. Whoever controls steel controls the pace at which civilization gets built. Want to construct a military base? You need steel. Want to expand your railway network? Steel. Want to build the factories that manufacture everything else on this list? You need steel first. China doesn't just participate in global construction. It sets the price, the supply, and the terms for nearly every nation on Earth that wants to build anything at all. And the West noticed. Western steel industries have been hollowed out over 30 years, made structurally uncompetitive by Chinese pricing that no domestic producer can match without government life support. The United States now imports steel to sustain industries it used to supply to the world. So ask yourself this: if a conflict broke out tomorrow and global steel supply chains snapped, who has the reserves, the capacity, and the infrastructure to keep building? The answer isn't complicated. The answer is the country that already makes half of everything. Steel is the skeleton of civilization, and right now, China holds the bones. But steel is just what you build with. What China did with concrete will genuinely make you stop and question everything you thought you knew about the scale of modern industrial power. Concrete, 3 years versus 100 years. If steel is the skeleton of civilization, concrete is the flesh, and no country in human history has consumed it at the rate China has. Between 2011 and 2013, a window of just 36 months, China used 6.6 gigatons of concrete. The United States, over the entire 20th century, used 4.5 gigatons. That means China poured more concrete in 3 years than America used to build the interstate highway system, the Hoover Dam. Every skyscraper in Manhattan, every airport, every bridge, and every federal building constructed across 100 years of the most aggressive infrastructure expansion in Western history. You heard that right. 3 years versus 100 years, and China still came out ahead. But this isn't just about raw consumption. China today produces and consumes roughly 60% of the world's cement. The Three Gorges Dam alone required 16 million tons of concrete to complete a single project, consuming more material than most nations build in a generation. And China has built dozens of projects at that scale, in the time it takes Western governments to finish the environmental review for a single highway extension. Here's the tension nobody wants to sit with. Infrastructure is compounding. Every road China builds opens a new economic corridor. Every port it constructs extends its logistical reach. Every city it raises from the ground becomes a new center of industrial output. The concrete was never just construction. It was the physical installation of a new world order, poured one slab at a time. And if you think controlling steel and concrete is powerful, wait until you hear what China controls that determines whether the lights stay on for the rest of the planet. Solar panels. Whoever controls the energy transition controls the future. The world made a decision. It decided to move away from fossil fuels. Every major economy on Earth signed on to that vision. Cleaner energy, lower emissions, a greener future. It was framed as a collective human achievement. What nobody told you is that the hardware powering that entire transition is made, overwhelmingly, in one country. China manufactures between 70 and 80% of the world's solar panels. Not the raw materials alone, the finished panels, the inverters, the mounting systems, the complete technology stack that turns sunlight into electricity. When Germany installs a solar farm, when California expands its grid, when India builds a renewable energy corridor, they are, in the vast majority of cases, doing it with Chinese-made equipment. You heard that right. The green energy revolution is, at its manufacturing core, a Chinese industrial story. But here's the tension that should make every Western energy minister deeply uncomfortable. Energy independence has been the rallying cry of Western governments for decades. End dependence on Middle Eastern oil, end dependence on Russian gas, build sovereign, self-sufficient clean energy grids. And yet, in pursuing that independence, the West has constructed an entirely new dependence, this time on Chinese factories for the very panels, batteries, and components that the clean grid runs on. The irony is almost surgical. You escaped one supply chain you couldn't control and walked directly into another one you also can't control. Except this time, the country holding the leverage isn't a petrostate. It's the world's largest manufacturer, with the industrial capacity to increase, decrease, or price adjust that supply anytime it chooses. Whoever controls the energy transition controls the future. Right now, that's China. But controlling energy infrastructure is one thing. What China controls next sits inside your body, and most people have no idea. Antibiotics, the supply chain under your skin. This is the one that hits differently. Because everything else on this list, steel, concrete, solar panels, those are things you can see, you can point to them, you can debate them in a policy meeting. But this one is invisible, and that invisibility is exactly what makes it so consequential. China is the world's largest exporter of antibiotic ingredients, accounting for roughly 44% of all global antibiotic ingredient exports. The United States, by comparison, holds approximately 4.5% of that same market, the raw material for the medicine that keeps people alive after surgery, after infection, after a battlefield wound. The active pharmaceutical ingredients that go into penicillin, amoxicillin, and dozens of other life-critical drugs flow predominantly out of Chinese factories. You heard that right. The country that controls nearly half the world's antibiotic supply chain is not America, not Europe. It's China. And then COVID-19 happened. For one brief, terrifying window, the world got a preview of what supply chain disruption in pharmaceutical manufacturing actually looks like. Hospital systems scrambled, governments panicked, emergency stockpiles evaporated in weeks. And then the crisis passed, the panic faded, and Western governments went straight back to arguing about tariffs instead of rebuilding a single domestic pharmaceutical production facility at scale. That's not negligence. That's something closer to strategic blindness. Because the leverage here isn't theoretical, it's biological. It doesn't require a missile or a sanction. It just requires a factory to slow down. Manufacturing dominance over medicine is the most intimate form of geopolitical power ever constructed. And China built it quietly, ingredient by ingredient. But if antibiotics represent leverage over human bodies, what comes next represents leverage over every weapon, every vehicle, and every device on Earth simultaneously. Rare earth magnets, the hidden core of everything. Most people have never held a rare earth magnet. Most people couldn't name one if you asked them. And that invisibility, that complete absence from public conversation, is precisely why this is the most dangerous manufacturing dominance on this entire list. China controls approximately 70% of global rare earth mining and processes nearly 90% of rare earth elements worldwide. Those numbers alone are staggering. But the reason they matter isn't the mining. It's what those materials become. Rare earth magnets are the critical component inside every advanced military fighter jet on Earth, every precision-guided missile, every autonomous drone system, every electric vehicle motor, every wind turbine generator. Every smartphone, every laptop, every piece of consumer electronics you have touched in the last 20 years, there is no substitution. There is no workaround. Without rare earth magnets, the most advanced weapon systems in the United States military do not function. You heard that right. The F-35, the most expensive weapons program in American history, depends on materials that are processed almost entirely in China. But here's the tension that should make that fact land even harder. The West has known about this dependency for over a decade. Congressional reports flagged it. Defense analysts published warnings. Think tanks produced white papers. And yet the structural dependency didn't shrink, it deepened, because awareness without industrial action is just expensive paperwork, and China understands this perfectly. It doesn't need to threaten anyone. It doesn't need to make a single phone call or fire a single shot. It simply needs to continue being the country that processes 90% of the material the entire world's advanced technology runs on. The leverage isn't a weapon. The leverage is the supply chain itself. This is the chokehold that connects military power, clean energy, and consumer electronics into a single, unbreakable grip. And right now, that grip belongs to China. But controlling the materials that go into everything is one thing. What China has done to control how everything moves across the world's oceans is an entirely different level of dominance. Shipbuilding, the Navy nobody talks about. Everything you've heard so far, the steel, the concrete, the solar panels, the antibiotics, the rare earth magnets, all of it eventually has to move across oceans, between continents, through the arteries of global trade that keep every economy on Earth alive, and the vessels that carry all of it. China builds those too. In 2024, Chinese shipyards captured 71% of all global shipbuilding orders. Not a third, not half. Nearly 3/4 of every ship ordered on Earth that year was contracted to a Chinese yard. South Korea, once China's most formidable rival in the industry, watched its market share collapse from nearly 30% to 17% in less than a decade. Japan, which once dominated global shipbuilding the way China dominates it now, has been reduced to single-digit relevance. You heard that right. China books more new ships in a single year than its two closest competitors combined. But this is where the tension becomes something you can't unfeel. The shipyards building those commercial bulk carriers and container vessels are the same industrial base, staffed by the same engineers, running the same steel, that builds the People's Liberation Army Navy, the fastest-growing naval force in modern history. Commercial shipbuilding dominance and military naval expansion are not two separate stories happening in parallel. They are one story, sharing the same infrastructure, the same workforce, and the same strategic intent. Global trade moves by ship, military power projects by ship. The country that builds the world's vessels sets the terms of how goods, energy, and force move across the planet. For most of the 20th century, that country was the United States. Today, it is not. He who controls shipbuilding controls the seas, and he who controls the seas controls the arteries of the world order itself. But controlling physical infrastructure is only half the picture. What happens when China starts dominating the industries the West told itself it would always lead? Semiconductors, robotics, and aerospace is where this story gets truly uncomfortable. Moving up the value chain. The lie the West keeps telling itself. There is one argument the West has clung to through all of this. One reassuring story that made every lost factory, every hollowed-out industrial town, every offshored production line feel acceptable. The story went like this. Yes, China makes the cheap stuff, the plastic toys, the fast fashion, the low-margin consumer goods. But the high-value industries, the semiconductors, the aircraft, the robotics, the biotechnology, those belong to us. That's where the real power lives. That's our lane. That story is now demonstrably, measurably false, and the numbers don't whisper it, they shout it. China is today the world's largest installer of industrial robots, automating its own factories at a pace no other nation has matched. It has launched the Comac C919, its own domestically produced commercial aircraft, directly challenging the Boeing and Airbus duopoly that the West assumed was untouchable. It produces more lithium-ion batteries than the rest of the world combined, dominating the single most critical component of the electric vehicle revolution. And despite every export control, every sanctions package, and every technology restriction Washington has thrown at it, China's semiconductor industry continues to advance slower than it would otherwise, but advancing nonetheless. But here's what should unsettle you most. China's value-added industrial output reached $5.66 trillion in 2024. The United States, in the same year, produced $2.91 trillion. China's industrial economy is now nearly double the size of America's, not in cheap goods, not in low-margin assembly work, but in total value-added manufacturing output. You heard that right. The gap between the world's largest manufacturer and the country that used to hold that title is not closing. It is almost 2-to-1, and it widens every single year. The cheap labor workshop narrative was always a comfortable illusion. The most dangerous lie in global economics is the one that lets you underestimate what you've already lost. And while China was building all of this, the West was busy doing something else entirely. And what it was doing instead is the part of this story that should make you genuinely angry. The distraction thesis, what the West was doing instead. Here is the part that doesn't require a conspiracy theory. It doesn't require a shadowy backroom deal or a grand act of sabotage. It just requires you to look at what Western governments were actually focused on while China was executing the most consequential industrial strategy in modern history. They were arguing about tariffs, about whether globalization was morally defensible, about quarterly earnings reports and shareholder returns, about which party was tougher on trade, about the optics of offshoring rather than the mechanics of rebuilding. For 30 years, the policy response to China's manufacturing rise was largely rhetorical speeches about competitiveness, summits about supply chain resilience, white papers about strategic industries, followed by almost no structural change whatsoever. And here's the tension nobody in a position of power wants to acknowledge. The numbers were never hidden. China's share of global manufacturing crossed 20%, then 25%, then 28%. All of it publicly tracked, all of it published in reports that were available to every trade minister, every defense secretary, and every economic advisor in the Western world. You didn't need classified intelligence to see this coming. You needed to read the data that was already sitting on the table. But reading inconvenient data requires accepting inconvenient conclusions. And the most inconvenient conclusion of all, that the post-war world order built on American manufacturing dominance was already over, was simply too destabilizing to say out loud in a policy meeting. So, the conversation kept getting redirected toward symptoms rather than causes, toward optics rather than output, toward the next election cycle rather than the next industrial decade. Meanwhile, China was not holding summits about competitiveness. It was building the factories. It was training the engineers. It was subsidizing the industries, laying the infrastructure, and executing 5-year plans with the kind of institutional patience that democratic election cycles structurally cannot match. While the West debated the philosophy of free trade, China was rewriting the terms of it from the factory floor up. So instead, the West talked about tariffs. It talked about decoupling. It talked about friendshoring and reshoring and nearshoring. And while it was talking, China was building. The gap between awareness and action is itself a form of surrender. And for a decade, the West surrendered quietly, word by word, meeting by meeting. But none of that distraction changes what the numbers actually say. And what they say when you finally stop and read them all together reframes everything. From 3% to 28%. The scoreboard nobody posted. Now that you've seen the individual categories, the steel, the concrete, the energy, the medicine, the magnets, the ships, the advanced industries, it's time to pull back and look at the single number that ties every one of them together. Because there is one statistic that sits above all the others. One figure that renders the entire debate about whether the world order has changed completely unnecessary. In 1990, China accounted for roughly 3% of global manufacturing output. 3%. At that moment, the United States held approximately 25%, nearly a quarter of everything the world made. The gap between the two nations was so vast, it didn't even register as a competition. It was a foregone conclusion. America made things. China assembled things cheaply for American companies. That was the arrangement. and it felt permanent. It was not permanent, not even close. By 2010, China had overtaken the United States as the world's largest manufacturer. By 2023, China's share of global manufacturing output had reached 28% more than the United States, Germany, and Japan combined. America's share in that same period had fallen from 25% to under 17% and continues to shrink. The gap between the two is not narrowing. It is widening every single year, in every single advanced category, across every metric that matters. You heard that right. In 30 years, China went from 3% to 28%, while America went from 25% to 17%. The lead didn't just change hands. It was rebuilt from scratch, in the opposite direction, at a scale the world had never seen before. This isn't a trend line, it's a verdict, and the verdict has been in for years. The scoreboard was always public. Nobody chose to post it where it could be seen. And now that you've seen every number, every category, and every fact, there is one final reframe that changes how all of it lands. Manufacturing is the world order, the reframe. Here is the insight that changes everything you just heard. When most people think about the world order, they think about diplomacy, military alliances, nuclear arsenals, reserve currencies, seats on the United Nations Security Council. They think of power as something declared in treaties and enforced by armies. But every single one of those things, every alliance, every currency, every military force is downstream of one foundational reality, downstream of who makes what. The Marshall Plan worked because America made things. Bretton Woods worked because America made things. NATO's credibility for 80 years rested, ultimately, on the industrial capacity of a country that could outproduce every adversary on Earth simultaneously. Strip away manufacturing dominance, and every other pillar of geopolitical power becomes negotiable. It always was. Now reassemble every fact you've absorbed in this video. China makes half the world's steel. It poured more concrete in 3 years than America did in a century. It manufactures the hardware the entire global energy transition runs on. It controls the supply chain for the medicine keeping people alive. It processes 90% of the materials inside every advanced weapon and every smartphone on Earth. It builds 3/4 of the world's ships, and its total industrial output is nearly double that of the United States. The world order the West spent 80 years building was never a permanent condition of history. It was a manufacturing story. And the manufacturing story has a new author. It has had one for years. You were just never handed the page. The numbers were always there. The payoff. Think back to the first thing you heard in this video. China manufactures more in a single day than most countries produce in an entire year. When you heard that at the start, it felt like a dramatic opener. A bold claim designed to grab your attention. But now, having walked through every category, every industry, every percentage, every 30-year shift, it doesn't feel dramatic anymore. It feels like an understatement. Because the single-day statistic is just the surface expression of something that runs far deeper. It is the daily output of a country that controls the skeleton of civilization. The pace of the energy transition, the medicine in global supply chains, the magnets inside every advanced weapon system, and the vessels that carry the world's trade across every ocean. That isn't one impressive number. That is the compounded result of the most deliberate, sustained, and successful industrial strategy in human history. And here is the final fact, the one that should stay with you long after this video ends. None of this required secrecy. None of it was hidden. China's manufacturing share has been publicly tracked, published, and available to every policymaker, analyst, and journalist on Earth for the entire duration of its rise. The data was never classified. The trend was never ambiguous. The conclusion was never complicated. The world order has already changed. Not is changing. Not could change if current trends continue. Has changed completely, measurably, and permanently. The numbers have been saying so for a decade. The only question that was ever left to answer is whether you were paying attention. Now, you are.